Welcome everybody. It's just after 12 o'clock on a nice warm summer day here at the end of July. My name is Benji Cohn, and I'd like to welcome Tony Long, our Mississippi River monitoring specialist out of the Lake City office. He's going to talk about just Tony, this is a really cool subject that I've heard a lot about the last couple of years. I've never personally tried it, but I'm really excited to learn more about it. So it's called micro fishing, trying to catch. Everybody in fishing tells stories about their fish getting bigger and bigger over the years as you go. We were talking about earlier, but this is not the case with micro fishing. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and we can all learn a little bit more about micro fishing.
Yeah. Uh, Thank you. Thanks for that intro. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I'm super excited to chat with everyone about this unique method of angling that's really starting to get some more light in the angling world. So, um, a little bit more about me. I was raised in the outdoors of Minnesota. I grew up fishing quite a bit. Started out bass fishing, but then within the last 10 or so years, I really grew to appreciate native fish and non-game fish specifically. Um, I've lived in 5 different states. I've worked in about 9 of the different states, and I started out as an intern here in Minnesota in Baudette in 2015. Um, from there, I moved almost in every state following the Canadian border to the north, all the way up to the Pacific Northwest in Washington. I've worked on mostly bigger rivers like the Missouri River and the Columbia River. Did a lot of work with larger river species such as sturgeon, paddlefish, and king salmon. I now work on Pool 4 of the Mississippi River with the long-term resource monitoring crew as part of our fish component here out of Lake City. I love all fish, big and small, specifically the unloved, underrepresented, and native fish. So let's kind of dig into how this microfishing started. So it rooted in Japan. A lot of sources suggested around the 17th century. Um, the Japanese have an intimate cultural connection with fish. They fished for bitterling or tanago. They would call it tanago fishing. And the goal of that was to catch a tanago, which is the fish in that picture there, that fits on a 1 yen coin. 1 yen coin diameter is just about 3/4 inch. So it's kind of similar to the size of a penny. There's no real definite history though, because a lot of countries did microfishing, but just didn't call it microfishing. So it's kind of tough to pin down an exact beginning of how this all started. But that kind of brings us into modern day microfishing. So around 2010, we started seeing some more reports of microfishing emerge. Social media really played a big role in this. YouTube, Facebook groups, Reddit, sites like roughfish.com, Species Hunters, personal blogs like Caught Off Guard. We really started to get more people across the world engaging in this sport. And then websites like Tenkara Bum and Anglers Emporium made gear easier to purchase online and get it shipped straight to your door. Because a lot of this stuff is imported from Japan. And all that combined is making it easier for people to get into the hobby, with social media making communication easier so people can discuss their catches, ID their catches, and really where to find these different species of fish. Now there's a decent amount of people that have caught over 1,000 species hook and line, which is just crazy to think about. So what is a microfish? Well, a lot of people just call it bait. Um, there's a lot more to it than just simply calling it bait. There's not really a firm definition, but a lot of the general guidelines are these. Typically smaller than panfish. Things like sunfish or perch, it's going to be smaller than that. Um, Max size of about 8 inches, and realistically stuff that's just too small to target with recreational tackle. So this picture up in the right is a pair of banded killifish from central Minnesota, and those would be a good example of microfish. Um, Things like baby bass, those are not micros. Um, Things like baby crappies, also not micros. However, things like minnows, shiners, darters, etc., those are micros. And we'll get into that a bit later here. So why would somebody want a microfish? That's really the grand question here. Um, it's super easy to get into. Now, gear is cheap comparatively speaking. When you're talking about walleye fishing or bass fishing, you don't really need a boat. All you got to do is just walk up to a shoreline and see what's swimming around. It's as easy or as hard as you want to make it. A lot of people who microfish like to do what's called life listing, which is very similar to people who birdwatch and keep a birding list. There's a lot of unique species out there. Um, People like to catch them all. So a lot of these micros bring you to unique geographical areas to find unique species. For example, that picture in the top right there is a swamp from South Carolina, and these little banded pygmy sunfish exist there. And you would never really know unless you started uh, getting in there and finding it out. There's a lot of biodiversity to be had and to be seen and to be explored. The picture in the bottom left is a bunch of darters from Georgia, including blue side, snub nose, and green side darters. Um, and so, what does it take to catch microfish? Well, you're going to need micro hooks. Um, this stuff is kind of just downscaled. Polarized sunglasses are very helpful to cut glare and to be able to see into the water, which is important for microfishing because a lot of this is sight fishing. The hooks and line, owner, new half moon, Tanago hooks are what you see in the picture there. Those are imported from Japan. Typically, these hooks come pre-snelled, so you don't have to worry about tying that small of line to these hooks because that would be a nightmare. Fly fishing hooks, size 26 or less, also work very well. And you can buy a lot of this stuff from Tenkara Bum, Anglers Emporium. I've gotten stuff on Amazon even, as well as eBay. When it comes to rods and reels, really all you need is a cane pole or a fly rod. You want something lightweight, portable. You need it to be versatile. Reels are not usually used as you just have to lift fish up. You're not fighting fish. There's no drag that really comes into play. You don't usually need to cast. It's mostly sight fishing. And so a lot of guys will make their own rods, or you can buy cane poles online that collapse down. I use ice fishing rods sometimes as well for more close quarters fishing. So you can kind of use whatever you want. Bait and tools, I usually just use composting worms, um, or you can flip rocks in the creeks to find some bugs like scuds or larvae. Some of the local insects work great. Some people use dough baits too that work well. I use a mustache trimming scissors and a small forceps to actually bait some of my hooks and trim the bait. And the forceps come in handy when you are unhooking these fish too, because these are small fish and you need to be delicate. You really, and you don't want too much bait on your hook. Just a fleck of worm is really all. A couple other things I encourage people to have are a dip net or just a small aquarium net to hold on to fish if you want to get pictures. So you're not holding that fish out of the water. And another thing is photo tanks. And we'll get into that in a little bit here, but photo tanks are a fantastic way to view these colorful fish from the side. So these fish are micro, they're delicate, they're small. How do we handle these fish? We want to keep them wet. You want to minimize exposure out of the water. These fish should be treated with care, so you always want to have your hands wet. And if you have a photo tank, get that photo tank prepared with water in it. So what is a photo tank? Well, these can be manufactured. A lot of people like to make their own, and you can use repurposed containers. So a lot of people custom make their own. So this picture on the far right is actually one I made myself. I cut the glass. I used PVC board and just siliconed it all together. You can use cheap picture frames even from Goodwill or something like that. I've done that in the past. The one in the middle is a manufactured one from Tenkara Bum. That one is acrylic. There is pros and cons to glass and acrylic. Acrylic can scratch easier, but it's a little bit easier to lightweight and to deal with. Glass is a little heavier, but it's clear. It's clear, and so it holds up a little better and doesn't scratch as much. Other manufactured ones include Photarium. This brand is out of Washington, and they have a little ruler on the bottom, and a lot of the proceeds from their photo tanks go to wild fish conservation. And still yet, you can repurpose containers. Like I used to use a Q-tip container, toothpick holders. Some guys use Bass plastic soft bags that are see-through, plastic critter keepers. I mean, you could use a flower vase even if it's square. The possibilities are realistically endless. So now that we kind of know what microfishing is, what a microfish is, and how we can catch them, where do we find them? So different species of fish live in different types of habitat, whether it's a stream or a lake. And within that habitat, there exists other habitats or microhabitats. So first, we're going to take a look at a stream here. So these blue arrows show which way the flow is moving. You can see different types of habitat labeled, such as riffles, runs, and pools. Riffles are rocky. They have fast flow where the water gets super oxygenated. And then there's pools, which are deeper and wider, and the water slows down. Lastly, there are runs. These are deeper with more of a uniform flow. And you'll get different fish that hang out in these different areas. Different fish feed differently. Different fish are adapted to different flow. And so you want to pick apart these different habitats to find all of these different fish that you're looking for. But rivers and streams are not the only place micros are found. Lakes and ponds can also hold micros that are not found in these streams. So within these systems, there's a littoral and a limnetic zone. The littoral zone is shallower, gets more sun. Typically, you're going to find a lot of your aquatic plants growing here, and those often hold a great number of micros. These plants hold food for micros. There's a lot of cover to hide from predators. And don't be afraid to check out shallow or sandy areas too without vegetation. Different types of darters and minnows are going to prefer a sand substrate over vegetation. There's also the limnetic zone. This is going to be more open water, a little bit deeper, and sometimes you'll find bigger shiners or minnows that will school out in that open water. So don't be afraid to really cover the spectrum. There's all kinds of different habitat to check out, and you never know what could be hiding where. So now that we know some of the habitat, what can we find out about these fish? How do we figure out what kind of fish live in our backyard? It's your responsibility to be ethical when microfishing and understanding what lives in your area. There can be endangered species present, and we want to make sure we avoid those as to not stress them. So many sites are available for figuring out what lives in your backyard. So the first one is FishMap. FishMap shows fish that are found within your watershed. You can type in a zip code, a watershed, or a search of fish by its species name, both common or scientific, and it'll show you where that fish is found as far as the watersheds across the country, or it'll show you, if you search by watershed, it'll just show you what's in your watershed. The next one is iNaturalist, and this is a fantastic tool um, that a lot of people use. It's a nonprofit social network of citizen scientists, biologists, and everyone in between posting findings across the globe. This encompasses all biological findings. And it's useful in seeing what can be found in your backyard, not just fish, but for the sake of this, we'll talk about just fish, because you can filter through the different types of critters, and you can select just fish, and it'll show you pins, and you can see what fish or people have been posting around your area. The next type of website that is great and useful for a lot of these for finding micros is put out by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or the MPCA. They are a stream organization that collects data across our state, and they have a website that's useful for looking at what biological fish and inverts can be found. And so in this image here, the screenshot, they have their legend, and the biology or the brown boxes, you can select those, and those will show you what fish they found at that site. And you can scroll and zoom around on the state and find different sites that are close to you. So the next one is the Fishes of Minnesota Mapper, which is also a website. It's a little clunky and it kind of takes some getting used to, um, but it can be very useful for looking up historical data. And so once again, you can zoom in and kind of scroll around on it. You can search fish by species, and you can filter it by date. And it's great for finding some historical information, like I mentioned. And this last one is a hard copy. It's a field guide. This is the second edition of the Peterson Field Guide to Freshwater Fishes of North America. And this is what I started with. It's a great resource for the country as a whole. It shows range maps. Um, it shows color palettes of different types of fish found. And it's really useful for being able to look at the differences between each fish. There's a few other Minnesota specific field guides, but typically they're more sport fish focused. with a few common macros thrown in, or they're a bit outdated. So now that we kind of know how to find what lives in our backyard, we're going to look at some of the fish groups that we can find. So one of the most unique ones, I think, are the darters. These are only found in North America. Um, there's about 150 plus different species. With advances in genetics, there's a lot of new species being parsed out from other ones. And these are roughly 20% of our freshwater fish that we have in North America. And they're in the same group as walleyes, saugers, and perch, which is kind of crazy. These fish are adapted for life in flowing water. They are found on the bottom. They have larger pectoral fins to hold them in place. They kind of appear to scoot or dart around, hence the name darter, underwater. And they'll be some of the most colorful fish that you will find. Especially these fish spawn in the spring, so especially in the spring, you'll find some really colorful fish. They like highly oxygenated water and cooler water temps, and so that's why they're typically found in streams. There are a few species that are found in lakes as well. Um, these fish can be hard to find though. It takes some adjusting and patience to see them from above. They can be spooky. This is really where those polarized sunglasses come in handy. It can be easier to target at night too with a headlight. They're not as spooky. But once you get a feel for where the darters hang out, you'll begin to spot them more readily. And some people will call this darter vision because you'll really be able to predict where they're hanging out. Like I said, these fish can be kind of spooky. And they can also be very picky with bait. Um, Typically, live bait works best, like worms, but sometimes they need or they'll be picky with what types of insects you're using. And so, looking for local aquatic insects, flipping rocks, that'll be your best bet in some cases. Patience is really crucial for these fish, especially if you're just starting out. You got to get a feel for where they hang out. Um, so these fish pictures are not from Minnesota. So that top picture is a greenside darter from North Carolina. The next one down is a sunburst darter from Missouri. And then we have a plateau darter from Missouri. And then lastly is a blue side darter from Tennessee. So you can really see these fish have a wide variety of color and patterns to them. The next group we're going to look at here is the minnows and shiners. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these here in minnows and shiners. A lot of people use these for bait for other fish, but we have a lot of species of minnows and shiners in North America. A lot of these too are found in streams, but there's quite a few species that are found in lakes and ponds as well. There's a wide variety of habitat that they'll exist in, from shallow shorelines to deeper open water, vegetation to rocky gravel substrates. They'll typically be in the mid to upper water column as opposed to the darters who are on the bottom. And then these fish too are usually pretty often willing to eat and chase bait and be aggressive. The males can have vibrant colors in spring. Um, like we can see in that middle picture, that's a common shiner caught here in Minnesota at peak spawning colors, and they'll get those nice blues and purples, some coppers and yellows, and even pinks. But then we have fish like the stone roller in the top right, which is an algae eater. They call them stone rollers because you'll see them flip stones around picking at bugs and algae. And still other fish, we got spot fin shiners in the left and Ozark minnows in the right. But wait, there's more. There's a lot more. We're just barely scratching the surface on all these different groups of fish. Um, Sculpin and mad toms, they're typically easier at night. They come out at night. They're nocturnal fish. They have big mouths and they're willing to eat a lot of stuff. They're not picky. They'll devour your live bait. And so that's a picture of a sculpin there in the bottom right from Wisconsin. And then we have killifish and top minnows. These are surface-oriented fish. They can be spooky sometimes, but they exhibit some pretty sweet colorations. Like that top left fish is a plains killifish from Nebraska, and the bottom left is a northern studfish from Arkansas. And then the last bigger group that we'll talk about is the dwarf and pygmy sunfish. So we talked about a pygmy sunfish earlier in that swamp habitat. This fish in the top right is a blue spotted sunfish from South Carolina, and they like that swampy kind of stuff too. They don't get as big as bluegills or pumpkin seeds. They stay pretty small. Um, Hence why they call them the dwarf sunfish. So we've seen kind of a lot of different fish from across the country, but let's really kind of dive down into Minnesota. So we have about 160 species of fish here in Minnesota. With our 10,000 lakes, 15 plus thousand miles of fishable streams and rivers, we got a pretty good range of habitat. In Minnesota, we're located where several biomes converge, which supports a rich variety of wildlife and opportunities for us to explore. So this first map kind of shows where these biomes converge. This can tell us a little bit about the types of waters we can find. We kind of see a shift from the northeast down to the southwest. So in this map, we can see the different water basins. We have 8 major basins here in Minnesota and 81 major surface watersheds, from the Rainy River up on the north, the Red River of the north, down to the lower Mississippi and the Minnesota River, and the St. Croix River. And so this kind of brings up how we can see this shift in habitat. We see the shift of fish, and how in the northeast we see a lot of trout waters, and then as you move down, you see a walleye into bass and panfish, and then we have our prairie lakes. So we have a lot to check out here in the state of Minnesota. And the good news is we have a lot of public access here in Minnesota as well. A great aspect to microfishing is access, and so you don't need a boat. Um, Minnesota is great for public access. We have a lot of opportunity. I used to live in Nebraska, and that in Nebraska, that state is roughly 3% public lands, which made things difficult. But here in Minnesota, we have about 25% public lands, which equates to about 12 million acres of federal, state, and county lands for us to enjoy. So this first public access tool is Lake Finder. And Lake Finder, even if you're fishing for game fish, is an extremely useful tool. The fisheries division in our state conducts surveys each year, and these surveys get put into Lake Finder, and so you can see what they caught with their different sampling methods. Um, you can pull up a lake, you can type it in the search box there, like you can see in that little snapshot, and it'll show you the boat accesses, which can be a great spot to find micros. Um, and so the next one is our Minnesota DNR Recreation Compass. Now, this is probably the ultimate tool that we have at our disposal for finding public lands. It's incredibly useful for scrolling around, seeing all our public land that we have, depending on where you live. You can use the legend on the right-hand side, you can see in that screenshot, to see the different public lands available. You can zoom in and get more information on them and click them. And it's just a very useful tool to see what's around you. A few examples of public lands that you'll see on the recreational compass are WMAs, or wildlife management areas. You'll see state forests, state parks, as well as other types of federal lands like national forests and things like that. Um, and then as well, we have city and county parks. If a small stream or something like that, or even a bigger river flows through a town, typically there'll be city or county parks that are there for you to use. Um, don't be afraid to get on Google Maps or Google Earth and zoom around. Finding spots to access can be helpful looking at satellite imagery, and then you can save those as pins on your phone as well. So what do we have to look for here in Minnesota? So I'm going to cover a few of my favorite areas of Minnesota for microfishing that really have some sweet fish to check out and chase down. So like I mentioned, we have about 160 species of fish in Minnesota, and about 140 of those are native. So to start with, we're going to look at the North Shore. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this area of Minnesota. It's a very popular place to recreate and enjoy the outdoors. But there's also some unique fish opportunities that exist there aside from trout and salmon fishing. The Lake Superior and its tributaries, there's things like three-spine sticklebacks, round goby, which are non-native and invasives. But you also have things like sculpin, different dace species. So that top left picture is a long-nosed dace caught in a Lake Superior tributary. And then we have a mottled sculpin in the top right. There's things like pearl dace, lake chubs. There's a lot of unique stuff up there that you won't find in the rest of the state. Um, Next is more central state. Here, you're going to find quite a melting pot of different fish species. This is kind of where our habitat shift. We have a lot of lakes in this area within our state. Kind of looking at the Detroit Lakes area, going east to the McGregor area. That's kind of a rough area of where I'm talking about. We have things like central mud minnows, which is that middle picture. They're a neat fish, an ambush predator. And then northern sunfish, which are very colorful little sunfish in the bottom left there. Gilt darters, which is in the bottom middle. They get neon oranges and some different shades of orange as you go throughout the body. They're really cool fish. And even things like least darters, which is that bottom right picture. These are some of the smallest fish you'll find in Minnesota. That's a full-grown adult male against my fingertip. And so it's pretty cool to see what exists in these areas. There's other things like northern red-bellied dace, Iowa darters, and all kinds of good stuff. So down in the southeast, this is kind of my backyard. We have a ton of stream diversity. Small streams, small rivers, large rivers. There's just so much habitat to try. And a lot of our colorful fish exist down here. There's quite a few darters down here that aren't in the rest of the state. But one thing you'll have to be mindful is we have trout regulations in a lot of our streams down here. So you just need to be cognizant of the regulations, because some places you can only use artificial lures and flies. You can't use live bait. But that aside, the Southeast has a very large diversity of fish. Rainbow darters, for instance, which is the picture in the bottom left and was also the picture in the beginning of the presentation. This is a pretty widespread fish down here in our smaller streams. Um, they're like those riffles like I was talking about, the rocky areas that are highly oxygenated. I like to call these the gateway microfish because they are plentiful. They're easier to catch than a lot of the other darters, and they're just stunning fish. There's a reason they call them rainbow darters. Um, Another cool darter that we can find down here is the fantail darter. They're not as colorful, but they get really cool patternings, almost like cheetah print, and they kind of look grumpy, so it's kind of funny too. Um, Southern red-bellied dace, which is the top right, another beautiful, colorful minnow that we get down here. The bottom right is a slimy sculpin. We'll get some of those in our trout streams farther southeast. And so we still have other things like stonecats, tadpole mad toms, even more types of minnows and shiners. It was pretty difficult trying to figure out which picture to put on this slide because there's a lot to see down here. And you could spend a whole summer and still not see everything. So we kind of know some of the fish. We kind of seen how we catch some of the fish. We got to go through some of the important things to know though while we're running around in our public lands. There are threatened and endangered fish that we have here in Minnesota, and it's illegal to target these in most cases, depending on what state you're in. So this goes back to being familiar with what's in your area. It's your responsibility to know what fish are found where you are. And poor handling practices. Um, Getting those photo tanks, like I said, keeping your hands wet. We don't want to stress these fish out to the point of death. Um, Examples of good handling practices are these two on the right. So that top right picture is a fish being held in the water. It's a three-spine stickleback. And then on the bottom right is a banded killifish being held in a photo tank to get a quick cell phone picture. We don't want to destroy the habitat where these fish are found. Some of these unique fish are found in unique habitats that isn't super plentiful. And so we need to be mindful. Care and caution must be taken to create as little of a disturbance as possible. And then invasive species, things like this round goby on the left. We got to be cognizant of when we're bringing bait home. There's bait and water transport laws. Invasive species can be transported via waders, shoes, bucketing water or fish, even bait. So please do not bring fish home unless you are within the regulations or properly permitted to do so, because we don't want to ruin it for other people. Fish, like I mentioned, that fish on the left there is a round goby. That picture is from Park Point in Duluth, and these round gobies are in the Great Lakes. They outcompete things like log perch for food, which log perch are a native darter. Um, and these fish can also prey on eggs and the fry of our other native fish that we enjoy out there. So that was a ton of information thrown at you guys, but we'll give a couple recaps here in these next few slides. So the gist of it is to pick apart a spot slowly. Try different areas, different ways of microfishing, finding that habitat within the habitat, sight fishing, drifting baits down, dropping into pockets of vegetation or rocks. Those are all really good ways to find different species of fish. There's a lot of different fish that live in a lot of different areas. And so it feels like it's unlimited options. Um, we want to be mindful. We want to respect our surroundings. So please pick up trash, be respectful, wet your hands before we handle these fish, have your photo tanks ready. If it's hot out, change your water out in your photo tank. You don't want to be putting one of these beautiful fish in a hot photo tank and have it die because the water's too hot. So there's a couple fish here in this slide that are found in Minnesota as well. So this top fish is an orange spotted sunfish. The bottom left is a banded darter. Orange spotted sunfish can be found in the southwest part of our state in the prairie lakes, in the prairie streams. Those banded darters, which get that neon green coloration, can be found here in the southeast. And then that darter on the bottom right is actually an orange belly darter from Oklahoma. So now what do we do? Do your homework, research what's local to you. If you plan on making a trip, do your research of the species you might come across in those watersheds, be it within our state or out of our state. Gather your gear, get all that stuff ready. If you want to make your own photo tanks, get out and start making those. Um, you want to be able to round up your stuff to get it to get out there and get fishing. Um, get out there and see what there is to catch, and importantly, enjoy yourself. Microfishing has brought me to some pretty cool places within our state, as well as across the country. I've made quite a few connections with friends across the country and other people. Um, I also encourage a lot of you to, if you're going to get into this, and even just normal fishing too, fishing logs. I started a fishing log back in 2018. I record my days fished, where I fished, what species I caught, how many, just a bunch of various notes, like if it was new species to me, who was with me, all the relevant stuff that is worth writing down. And I've referenced this a lot more than I would have ever thought. And so I encourage everybody to start one of those, be it on Excel or just writing it down on a piece of paper, using your phone, an app. Um, there's some social media groups that I think are worth taking a look at when it comes to getting into microfishing, non-game fish, and native fish in general. The first one is NANFA, which is the North American Native Fishes Association. It's both an organization and a Facebook group. And that group actually started here in Minnesota just over 50 years ago. It's an excellent resource for finding like-minded people. Another great Facebook group is the Art of Microfishing, sharing your catches, posting them up there, showing them off, meeting other people, meeting like-minded people that you might uh, find in your backyard that also do the same stuff. There's a wealth of knowledge to be had out there. Um, the Rough Fish Facebook group is another great Facebook group, as well as a website to host your life list groups. People post them on there, and it's a good way to reference back to. So there's a wealth of knowledge that you can glean from other people that have been doing it longer than you or I have. And it's always fun to share catches. It's fun to see what other people are finding. Like I mentioned, you never know what people might find in your backyard. Um, Meeting other people, have meetups. It's fun to fish with other people. So microfishing is about appreciating that beauty and the diversity of these smaller fishes. And so I really want to thank everyone for participating, learning about this new corner of the angling community. If you've been looking for new ways to just enjoy the outdoors or give yourself a new set of challenges, I think this is a great option. If you have any further questions, comments, or anything else, I'm going to list my email there. Please feel free to reach out. I'll do my best to assist you. I'll leave you guys with a few cool pictures from fish I have found down in the southeast.
That's great, Tony. Thanks for sharing all that information. I think this is one of those Moss webinars that people are going to come back and watch a couple times. You had so much good information in there. So,
Yeah, there's a
uh,
lot to be thrown out there and not a lot of time to give it all.
yeah, we could probably spend a couple hours on this if we really wanted to. And I really appreciate the stewardship part. It's one of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship here series of webinars. It's one of those parts we really like to stress, and you did a fantastic job of, especially in these hot summer days like this, of changing your water in your pitcher thing, or not catching fish that are going to get stressed out with long fights and stuff like that. So I appreciate you sharing that.
You bet.
Um, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A section. We got a couple in there. If you want to take your PowerPoint down whenever you're ready there, Tony, people copy your email address down. So Sabrina had a great question here about how many different species have you personally caught? You talked a little bit about keeping a record there.
Yeah. Um, so I've done some saltwater fishing, but I've been more focused on freshwater. And so I think I'm up to I the last or this year I surpassed 150 species caught hook and line, um, strictly freshwater. And so that's that's pretty good for what I think. But I know a lot of people. I have buddies who have passed 400 and 500, so it feels like it's a never-ending thing, and it's pretty fun though.
Wow,
But yeah, just over 150.
that's a lot. Do you have any favorites, or what's your most rare catch?
Um, that's a good question. I think some of my favorites are um, from the NANFA organization has a convention every year that a bunch of friends and I travel around the country. And last year it was in South Carolina, and we are staying up long hours. I mean, it's like 2 or 3 in the morning. We're still looking for fish. And I think some of my most memorable catches have been us super tired, standing over the water with headlights, probably looking like crazy people. And then one of us catches that darter that we wanted, and we're all screaming and hooting and hollering. So some of those, I don't have any fish that stick out in my mind specifically, but memories like that are what sticks out in my mind. So it's pretty entertaining.
It's a really cool experience. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. If you want to pull your presentation on, you can do that. We're seeing the PowerPoint part there. There you go.
There we go. Yep.
Mary had a question. You need a fishing license, right? And then she was wondering about any other regulations. You mentioned the bait restrictions in Southeast Minnesota, but
Yeah. Yep. So you do need a fishing license, just like any other type of angling. Um, It really, as long as you're just not transporting fish, you don't want to be carrying buckets of water and bringing fish home. That's where you can get into trouble. Um, just, I mean, I don't bring fish home to just bring them home to ID them later. I just take my pictures and I leave it at that and put the fish back. And it kind of like the stewardship thing, knowing what's around you, um, doing a little bit of research beforehand really helps out with that.
awesome. Madeline, hi Madeline. Haven't seen you for a long time. What are your favorite, her question is, what are your favorite places to microfish?
That is a great question. I think I'm gonna
Probably a
keep it.
hard one, right?
Yeah, it is a hard one. I think I'm going to keep it to Minnesota specific just to limit myself. Um, but like I mentioned, down here in the southeast, we have some gorgeous, gorgeous streams that run through in the bluff country, and often you'll not have cell phone service, which I always appreciate. Then people don't bug me while I'm out fishing. And I think like that last picture that I had on my presentation was a bunch of rainbow darters. So just sitting in a stream down here in the southeast, just looking for darters. That's some of my favorite things to do here in Minnesota. Favorite area.
It is a pretty cool area of Minnesota. You mentioned it too, and I've mentioned in this program before. We were so lucky in Minnesota to have the public land, the public accesses, and just the variety of habitats and stuff that we do. It's just amazing to me, especially like you've lived in several other states. I've traveled a fair amount. We are pretty fortunate around here. So
Definitely, definitely.
yeah, I happen to know Madeline lives in kind of the southwest metro area. Do you have any specific places out there that you've done some fishing or
Southwest. So trying to
like
think.
Savage, Chaska, Carver County
Yeah,
area out there?
I don't have anything specific for that area. I know like that whole um, Minnetonka system too. There's a lot of streams and that run around in there. So looking for and realistically any lake in that area. If you're looking for areas that kind of the habitat will shift, and so a lot of culvert areas will be good for that because you'll get a change in flow between lakes, and so sometimes you'll get different types of fish that hang out there. That's always a great spot to check, or at least to start off with, and then branch out from there.
Awesome. And you mentioned some of these fish are just the pictures you show are just they're beautiful fish, especially when they're in that cool spawning colors. But because of that, people might want to take them home. So Jeff asked, can you keep any of these fish in a home aquarium? And what are the requirements if you do or to do so?
Right, right. So Minnesota is fairly strict on that. We have to you have to be careful what you take home. Um, There is with the Minnesota Aquarium Society, you can reach out to them. I believe they put on darter hunts. And so there's a gal that is permitted to do so, to take some fish home. So if you go along with her, like I said, you're gonna have to get in touch with the Minnesota Aquarium Society. Um, but if you go along with her, you're able to take home some of those darters, like the rainbow darters or fantail darters for your home aquariums. But outside of that, it's pretty strict.
Good to know. And Jameson is wondering, fascinating, well, he says, fascinating presentation, Tony. Do you have any suggestions on aspiring urban micro anglers? Maybe stormwater ponds, perhaps, or some in the urban environment?
Yeah. So um, within the cities itself, the Twin Cities, you have the Minnesota, you have Minnesota River, you have the Mississippi River, and you have the St. Croix River. So you actually have a lot of cool opportunities if you're willing to kind of travel around in those urban environments. But looking for, like I had mentioned, the culverts, looking for where the flow changes, you'll get different fish. Looking for beds of vegetation within lakes along shorelines. Um, that's kind of the gist of it.
Okay. Uh, Bob asking another question about licensing. Yes, you do need a license for microfish. Um, our astute observer Jeff says, "Love the T-shirt, darting around." I like that.
Yeah, thank you.
And David, oh, I just David is asking, any way to microfish in turbid water?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not as easy, I will say that. If the water is flowing, you can look for current seams. So if you kind of watch the top of the water, you can see how the flow is moving. And looking for those current seams where there's some slack water or what's called eddies where the water is swirling, you can drift baits through there. And if there's minnows or shiners, they'll find those and snap it up. But if it's a lake, kind of looking like along shorelines, if you see rocky outcrops or stuff like that, kind of just drag your bait around those rocks, and you might find something.
If anybody has any other questions, put them in the Q&A. Again, this is just a fantastic, it's one of those things I haven't tried yet, and I'm actually going out fishing for a little bit tomorrow, so I might have to see. I know I have some real small, like number 24 flies.
Yeah,
I have to give one of those a shot tomorrow. If I
absolutely,
can find them.
absolutely. Some of those bigger shiners too, that'll work great. They'll snap them up.
Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Next week we have episode 175 already, tracking kestrels. So it'll be a really neat talk. Um, just talking about how we research some of the non-game species in Minnesota and the bird species. So Kristen Hall is going to join us, our non-game wildlife program coordinator. So hope everybody has a safe and fun weekend out there. Hopefully you can get out and try a new type of fishing this weekend, and let us know how it goes, and reach out if you have any questions to myself or Tony, and we can be happy to chat with you. And or I'd be happy to put you in touch with Tony. He'd probably be really happy to talk to you. He's more knowledgeable than I am.
Absolutely.
So everybody take care, have a safe weekend, and we'll hopefully see you next week. So see you everybody.